Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
One of the ways we're going to liberate ourselves from the authoritarian regime that has taken over the United States is through recognizing and naming how they're using language to dominate us and our neighbors by redefining sacred terms that are valued by most Christians in a way that promotes the imperial impulses of those who want power. I released an article earlier this week with Baptist News Global titled, "What is the Church and What is Communion?" In this piece, I show how the authoritarian Christian nationalists who claim to be the most committed to Christianity are actually redefining Christ as Caesar, the church as empire, and communion as an exercise of power over one's neighbors. And in the days since the article released, I've heard from quite a number of people with a few different responses. Most people have said it was really helpful and made a lot of sense. Many people have shared how these redefinitions of some basic Christian theological terms have showed up in a variety of traditions, from fundamentalist Baptist to New Apostolic Reformation and many in between. But others have questioned whether the people I quoted in the piece actually said the things I claimed they said. Among those people, some have wanted to hear it for themselves, while others have outright denied that these things were even said. So, for the record, I don't make up quotes for my articles. You can disagree with my conclusions about a topic or with my interpretation of a quote, but if I quote someone, they actually said what I quoted them saying. A published news article written by a journalist is not the same as a shared meme that may or may not be true. Every quote I share has been verified. Also, the story has continued to develop this week after the article was published to include a redefinition of the term revival. So for today's episode, I'd like to walk through that piece that I wrote about how Trump supporters are redefining the church and communion. And in doing so, I'd also like to share some audio with you to hear these examples firsthand, and I'll be adding some discussion of how authoritarian Christian nationalists have redefined revival as recently as this week. So the article starts off where I talk about how there's been a lot of people writing about how white evangelical Republicans have descended into this abyss of authoritarianism. And these are the people who claim to be the most committed to Christ in the church. And, they think that other people aren't really true Christians. They're the true Christians. And yet, by removing themselves and disconnecting themselves from empathy and embracing empire, they've actually redefined some of these most basic terms that Christians believe in. So, for example, Jesus said in Matthew 16:18, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." The Greek word for church here is ecclesia, which means a called-out assembly or congregation. And so here was Secretary of War Pete Hegseth at Charlie Kirk's memorial service.
Marco mentioned this arena and the millions watching. A couple days ago, I learned that Kirk, actually in the German language, means church. So on this Sunday morning, I'd like to think we're all in Charlie's church.
This idea that Hegseth talked about, where Kirk is the German word for church, it's not original to Hegseth. It's actually a term that is used by the church he attends in Washington, D.C., that is tied to the Christian nationalist and misogynist Doug Wilson, who uses Kirk as the name church in its church name. In fact, their church website is Christ Kirk, not Christ Church. So my question is this the church? And in the article, I ask this: if the Gospels in the Bible subverted the gospel of empire by casting Jesus as the anti-Caesar, then were the worshipers at Charlie's church really preaching the gospel? As BNG's Mara Richards-Bim observed, what struck me most about the service was the escalation of efforts to deify Kirk and articulate a gospel of MAGA. And it's been so interesting because when those of us who are not part of MAGA try to share our concerns about that worship service, people are meeting us with sharp condemnation. In fact, one Christian nationalist who was defending Kirk on social media last week said, quote, God is turning to the political realm because the churches have become soft on sin and scared to offend someone. So basically, we've got Jesus talking about how the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church, and yet this guy is saying that Jesus has actually given up on the church because the church is too soft on sin. This is a common trope that goes back even to my childhood. I remember we would often talk about the churches in the book of Revelation, and one of them was the Church of Laodicea. And so the Church of Laodicea was like how we considered the Church of the End Times, which was a way of criticizing the church in America as being liberal. And we had different reasons for that. Some of us said they were too liberal because of music standards or dress standards. Those were the concerns of fundamentalists. And yet, whatever proof you brought to the table of them being too liberal and soft on sin, the fact was that we all believed that the church has become soft. And usually, I would say today, that's probably more dealing with LGBTQ issues. And so there's just this assumption, the church is soft on sin. We need the church to be mean again. We need the church to offend people again. And so, of course, Trump is mean. Trump is offensive. God is going to have to turn to Trump because the church, failed to do what Trump is willing to do. So the question that comes up here is, who or what is the church? Wayne Grudem is a popular theologian in white evangelicalism, and he defines the church as the community of all true believers for all time. That is, the church made up of all the men and women who have been, are, or ever will be true believers in Jesus. And Jeff Vanderstelt, who is a founder of a global family of churches known as SOMA, he said, quote, "The church is the regenerate people of God, saved by the power of God for the purposes of God in this world." Now, that may sound a little buzzy, a little Christianese, and it's a definition that's probably going to just kind of go over the heads of a lot of Christians. Oh yeah, we believe that, the purposes of God. But it's important to stop and ask, what exactly are those purposes? Because many Christians will give answers like glorifying God, or making disciples, or building the kingdom. But again, what does that mean to white evangelicals today? Because in today's authoritarian Christian nationalism, this is where the slippery slope toward redefining Christ as Caesar and the church as empire begins to take shape. Because they'll take an idea like glorifying God and they'll redefine it as submission to a hierarchy. Or they'll take something like making disciples and they'll translate that into politics by talking about making disciples of nations. Or they'll take something like building the kingdom and they'll interpret it as taking the hierarchies of authority and submission that are ever present within the church walls through politics to take those dynamics onto the nation as a whole. And so there's this connection here between the dynamics of what happens in worship within the four walls to what happens outside of the four walls. That action of taking those dynamics from within the walls to outside of the walls is what is referred to as revival. They believe that outside the walls, America is spiritually dead, and revival is where God is going to reawaken outside the church walls the very values that are happening within the church walls. So I've talked some about Charlie Kirk's memorial service. I've written about it. But one of the most disturbing things has not even so much been the mainstream worship leaders who attended and the things that they said during the service, but the way they've reacted after the service is over in a way that is just not reflective of the harm that their presence caused by being there. So, as a reminder, here was audio from Stephen Miller at the event and what he was communicating to the people about those who oppose the Trump administration.
You have nothing. You are nothing. You are wickedness. You are jealousy. You are envy. You are hatred. You are nothing. You can build nothing. You can produce nothing. You can create nothing. We are the ones who build. We are the ones who create. We are the ones who lift up humanity.
Now, when we listen to that, it sounds very dark. It sounds very ominous. But for some reason, a lot of white evangelicals are not taking this event in that way. And I think a reason why is due to what I wrote about in a previous article titled "Evangelical Worship is the Sugar That Helps the Poison of Power Go Down." Because evangelicals are just basking in the beauty of what happened at the Kirk Memorial. And I think when you overlay the sound of worship with the words of Stephen Miller, you can kind of see what's happening here. This was a moment during the memorial service that a lot of worship leaders have referred to as this really powerful example of the presence of God at the service. And when we take the strings of this section, and it is a beautiful music, and we put that underneath the words of Stephen Miller, suddenly it almost feels like you're in this inspiring movie. And I think one of the things that's happening is that white evangelicals are missing the inhumanity of what Stephen Miller is saying because the worship is serving as a sugar that's helping the poison of the power go down because they're just swept up in the sound of the strings. And so what I want to do is I've remixed this where we're going to listen to the words of Stephen Miller, but with the worship sound underneath it. And you can see, I think, if you don't pay attention to the words, how white evangelicals would be so caught up in the mood and in the emotion and the feeling of it all that they would miss how people are being dehumanized.
You have nothing. You are nothing. You are wickedness. You are jealousy. You are envy. You are hatred. You are nothing. You can build nothing. You can produce nothing. You can create nothing. We are the ones who build. We are the ones who create. We are the ones who lift up humanity.
So with that in mind, Chris Tomlin went on a podcast after the service was over, and he looked back on his experience there, and this is how he saw it.
For Jesus to be proclaimed so boldly throughout the whole day by everyone, basically, pointing people, was what an awakening moment in our nation. It feels like that. It feels like a shift, right? It feels like this real awakening that so many people have been praying for. What an amazing thing. Obviously, I'm still like in the glow of it, I think.
And similarly, Brandon Lake, who's another very popular worship leader, this is what he had to say.
I don't know what's happening right now, but it is the closest thing, if not absolute revival. Y'all, I've been praying for revival about my whole life, and I never in a million years thought that he would bring about revival in this way.
Yeah.
I always thought it would happen in the four walls of a church, and the church is happening maybe even more so outside of the four walls of where you attend on Sunday.
So it's important for us to connect how they are redefining the church from what happens within the four walls to what happens outside the four walls, so that now this political fest is a church worship gathering. Even though it's really promoting the dynamics of Trump, this is now considered a worship service of the church. So the second term is communion. And communion is one of those featured practices in the church. It's a sacrament. It's considered very sacred. There are obviously differences between Catholics and Protestants and what they believe happens at communion. And it's funny, I mentioned in my piece that the Kirk Memorial Service didn't actually celebrate communion. And that's not surprising to me, because according to the National Association of Evangelicals, 70% of evangelical churches celebrate communion just once a month, with many of the rest opting for quarterly. So, of course, it's no surprise that the organizers of Charlie's church would overlook it. But that said, in these Christian nationalist worship gatherings outside of the church, besides this one, communion is very often a mainstay for these worship services, but not in the way that you think. So, whatever differences there are between Catholics and Protestants regarding the presence of Jesus in communion, Jesus spoke of eating the bread and drinking the wine in remembrance of him. When Paul spoke of communion, he spoke of it as proclaiming Jesus' death. And so I think that however we consider the presence of Jesus manifest in communion, I think for both Jesus and Paul, communion was about, at the very least, the presence of God with those who are suffering on the underside of power. It's a belonging around the table where people that are normally placed in an ancient Roman hierarchy are now seated together as brothers and sisters with Jesus, who identifies as their brother, at a table of common mutual belonging. And on the underside of empire, suffering with his body broken and blood being shed. But for authoritarian Christian nationalists, the image here is the total opposite. So when Sean Feucht's Kingdom to the Capital tour participated in the sacrament of communion, they talked about the blood of Jesus not as the suffering of God on the underside of power, but as the highest authority of God that inspires Christian nationalists to embrace the highest authority over their cities and states.
And I declare right now, Jesus, your blood is the highest authority. I feel the Holy Ghost. I got goosebumps, and it's not because it's cold. I feel him right here. Come on, would you pray this with me? Would you declare he's the highest authority? I feel like you're supposed to do it over your state right now. Wherever you're from, say your state. I declare, Jesus, you're the highest authority over Texas. Now say your city. Lord, I declare you're the highest authority over Fort Worth. You're the highest authority over Dallas. You're the highest authority over Orange County. You're the highest authority over Miami. Where are you from? You're the highest authority over Columbus. You're the highest authority over Seattle. You're the highest authority over Portland. We declare, Jesus, your blood is the highest authority. We declare your blood speaks a better word. We declare your blood heals. Your blood delivers. We declare your blood saves. Someone just declare, America will be saved. Now would you just do it again, but would you do it with passion like you believe it? Come on, declare America will be saved. Come on, declare your state will be saved. Come on, declare your city will be saved. Come on, declare your family will be saved. We declare the blood of Jesus is the highest authority. So we declare no other spirit has authority. We declare the blood has the final say. Come on, let's take the blood together.
In D.C. that month, I mentioned how there was an event called the A Million Women March. And at that event, they also received communion on Capitol Hill. And they talked about how when they took the Lord's communion, they said, we're now believing the veil has been torn over the whole nation. And they told everyone to stretch their arms forward and to begin to command a mass beholding of the Lamb of God. So 250,000 people on the National Mall are stretching their arms out in all four directions, and they chanted the word behold 7 times. So in this world, these political gatherings outside of the traditional church worship gatherings are now being called the church. And the presence of God in communion is no longer being defined as the suffering servant subverting the empire, but as the highest authority wielding the empire. And so now, with that, the church is being traded in and redefined as the empire. So we need to go back to this term ecclesia that we mentioned at the beginning. Because in the Roman Empire, the Greek term ecclesia meant a governing body. So the early church began using the term, and when they used it, they were using it more as a co-opting or a subversion, or as Matthew D. Taylor put it, a revolutionary appropriation in order to liberate us from our harmful assumptions about power. And this is something that is very common in the New Apostolic Reformation. This is why megachurches are trying to take over city councils. It's why the city elders movement is growing. They say we're exchanging a congregational mindset for a congressional mindset. And so during one of his events at a university, this young black man came to Charlie Kirk, and he decided to confront Charlie Kirk about his views of Christian nationalism and said that he believed Christian nationalism was antithetical to the values of the early church. And this is the conversation that took place from there with Charlie Kirk.
So I'm particularly concerned about your brand of Christianity. As a Christian myself, Christian nationalism I do not agree with at all. I think it's antithetical to the values of the early church. And I think, how do you reconcile especially white Christians in this America, marrying politics and power with their faith in this country?
Well, there's a lot there. I've never described myself as a Christian nationalist. So I'm a Christian and a nationalist, so I've never used those two.
And then right there, that and nationalist, where in the scriptures does a Christian...
Well, thank you. Jeremiah 29:7, demand the welfare of the nation that you are in, because your welfare is tied to your nation's welfare. Let me continue. Daniel fasted and prayed for his nation. Esther and Mordecai cared for their nation. They were counsel to the king.
Right.
Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Joseph, Jacob. I could keep on going. Moses, Aaron. In fact, Moses was so political that he wrote an entire book of the Torah all about how to set up a government. It's the book of Deuteronomy. So, in fact, the Bible is an explicitly political text amongst many other things.
Now, can we interpret those texts in the light of the revelation of Christ? Because you just cited all Old Testament texts, but you've not once cited St. Paul.
Okay, yeah. If you want me to also, by the way, just so we are
St. Paul about the kingdom of heaven and the government.
Just so we're clear, do you think that the New Testament is greater than the Old Testament?
It is. It is greater because the revelation of Christ dictates how we interpret the Old Testament.
So you think that all of a sudden, like Genesis 1 is not as great just because of the New Testament?
The Old Testament was a type and shadow of the things to come, and now we live in the full revelation of Christ.
Again,
It is by definition
that is such
lesser.
a dangerous theological...
That's not true. That's Christological theology.
Hold on. Of course I believe in the resurrection. But to all of a sudden say that, like, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is, like, somehow lesser because of the revelation of the New Testament. Christ even said, I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets, I came to fulfill the law. In fact, he said all the laws of the prophet hang on the two teachings, Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 3 through 5. However, to use a New Testament example, as you asked, it says in 1 Timothy, pray for your leaders and authority by name that they might make righteous and great decisions. I'm going to continue. Christ our Lord said, on this rock build my what?
Church.
Wrong. Ecclesia. It's not the word church.
Okay,
the word
English
church,
translations of Common Bible say church, so my bad.
Well, actually, it shouldn't, because the original Greek term says, on this rock build my government structure. Ecclesia was a secular word used in that time, which was all about the advancement of freedom and liberty, which are the two words in Greek, eleutheria and isonomia, which are the two words there. So the point being, Christ called us to be salt and light. We as Christians should change the environment that we come in contact with. That's what salt and light do. So why should we then not care about changing government to be more Christ-like?
So again, Charlie Kirk here is not promoting any kind of subversive view of the church. He's not offering any kind of transformative view of the church. Instead, he's saying that the term ecclesia, he says it means on this rock build my government structure. He's literally denies that it was the word church. He said Christ called us to be salt and light, and we as Christians should change the environment we come into contact with. That's what salt and light do. So why should we then not care about changing government to be more Christ-like? And as I concluded in my piece, I said, and that's precisely the problem. By redefining worship gatherings as pyrotechnic political sparkle fests, redefining communion as the highest authority, and redefining the church as government structure, they haven't actually made the empire more Christ-like. They've simply redefined Christ-like in terms of empire and thus have redefined Christ in the church. And then I close with, so maybe Pete Hegseth was right. Maybe they actually were in Charlie's church. So with all of that redefining going on, we come to this week. And on Tuesday, video came out of government agents dropping from Black Hawk helicopters down onto an apartment building in Chicago. Here's how Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson described the scene.
We are here today to talk about the events that have transpired over the past week. The past week revealed the true face of the administration's immigration enforcement in our city, and the entire world was able to witness that. On Tuesday, federal immigration agents raided an apartment building in the South Shore community in the middle of the night. This building was managed by a slumlord that people have all been clear about. The city actually sued the owner in February over 15 building code violations. The residents were dealing with deplorable conditions already, and this was before ICE trampled on them. But when they came in the middle of the night, they terrorized the families that were living there. There were children who were without clothing. They were zip-tied, taken outside at 3 o'clock in the morning. A senior resident, an American citizen, with no warrants, was taken outside and handcuffed for 3 hours. Doors were blown off their hinges, walls were broken through. Immigration agents coming from Black Hawk helicopters to set up snipers on nearby buildings. This is America. One resident described the situation plainly, and I quote, "They had immigrants in one van and black people in another van." This raid wasn't about public safety. It was about and it's certainly not about immigration. This was about a show of authoritarianism, a forceful display of tyranny. They sent a clear message to all Chicagoans. They said, "We do not respect your rights. We can do anything we want, and we will film it and put it on social media."
So the government is now using Black Hawk helicopters at night to drop federal agents onto apartment building roofs. They're barging through doors and taking terrified naked children into the streets and zip-tying them at 3 a.m. These are the types of things we were warned about for decades by white evangelicals. When I was a kid growing up in independent Baptist fundamentalism, we were often warned at church that the government would do these things someday. And our only hope was revival. So every year we hosted these revival meetings, which were basically church services at night over the course of an entire week that were primarily aimed at getting people saved or convincing Christians to pursue some form of what we called full-time Christian service. For us, the nation had spiritually died and needed to be revived by becoming conservative Christian again. And of course, as a kid, these meetings often traumatized me with fiery messages about hell or terrifying warnings about the rapture. But there was also a political underbelly to them. In the 1990s, they tended to invoke fears of Bill Clinton and the Democrats handing the United States over to the United Nations and submitting to a one-world government and a one-world religion. And over the next 3 decades, that political unrest continued to simmer until white evangelicals chose their strongman Trump to rescue them. So as we consider these events we've covered today, what we're noticing is that these authoritarian Christian nationalists are redefining worship gatherings as pyrotechnic political sparkle fests, redefining communion as the highest authority, redefining the church as a government structure, and are now redefining revival not as God renewing within us a commitment to loving our neighbors as ourselves, and not as God producing the fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in us. But revival is now being redefined as the United States government dropping federal agents down on an apartment building at 3 a.m. from Black Hawk helicopters to barge into apartments, take naked, terrified children out into the streets as snipers look down on them from above, and zip-tie them. Remember, the dynamics that are within the church, they're setting up hierarchies where children are at the bottom, and that commit violence against children. We covered this in my interview with R.L. Stoller last week. Now they're taking those dynamics out into the streets because revival is the action of awakening outside the church walls the dynamics that are happening within the church walls. And I'm not just making that connection logically in my head. That's actually explicitly what they were calling this event. Because on October 7th, the Department of Homeland Security released a highlight video that showed agents rappelling out of helicopters, waking people up out of their sleep, shooting off tear gas, and tying them up. And the soundtrack to the entire video was a song called All Night Revival.
Lord, forgive us, my boys and me. We're having an all-night revival. Some will call the women and some will steal the Bible.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.